Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Avorion episode 25. I'm Enigmius, and today, all about the curves. All about making things round. We've got the back end of the ship closed off. You can see we've got the grates to make it really difficult for anyone to shoot directly at our engines, which are obviously in behind those grates. And now we've got all of this flat space on the back end that I wanted to kind of take care of and make it look a little bit more interesting, make it fit a little bit better with the theme of the ship so far. And then we've also got the nacelles, the back end of the nacelles, to give a little bit of thought to. So the shape of the ship up to this point is pretty round. It's based on profiles derived from circles and basically kind of meeting one another and some soft transitions and just really a very simple kind of design. It's almost as if for the main body of the ship we've got 3 cylinders, the one in the middle ever so slightly larger than the 2 on the outside, and then they're joined together. And then we've got the nacelles, which are even smaller circles, cylinders. That's basically the design. What's going on in the front of the ship, we looked at, and there's going to be a bit of difference on the front end of the ship in terms of the theme, as well as some of the other things that we'll be adding to the back end once we're into that final stage of doing the last little bit of detailing to kind of break up this whole kind of shape. Because I like having sort of a unified theme. I like having an idea where you look at something and it kind of has that appearance that it was designed as a whole. But I also like contrasting profiles and contrasting shapes used in moderation to kind of break things up and create a little bit of interest and make it a little less monotonous, I guess, is another way of putting things. So you can see what we've been doing here while I've been nattering is setting up a basic sort of profile using the 4-sided pyramid blocks, not to be confused with the 5-sided pyramid blocks, to start bringing things in, start sort of squishing the back end in a little bit, using a basic slope block wherever we've got a perpendicular or parallel sort of shape. Whenever it's flat, basically we use those slopes, but everywhere else is basically at an angle. The profiles that we pulled back from the main hull section, they're all at an angle, so when we continue with that, and instead of just bringing them straight back the way that we've done basically for the entire shape of the hull up to this point, we start using these 4-sided pyramid blocks and the inside corner blocks in conjunction with one another to start moving things in. And when we do them, I mentioned this, I don't think in the last episode, but the episode before, when we do this in a way where the only thing that we're really changing is the length of the block as we're moving backwards. We keep basically the thickness, we keep the width, but we're changing the length. And because it's an angle block, that means we're changing the angle, and the angle becomes a little bit less than its predecessor, or depending on how you look at it, it's a little bit larger of an angle. If you had your protractor out and you're going around the ship, the angle would look a little bit larger in some of the blocks, even though the end result is to taper it off. And you can see coming down the back side here, I just decided to do a bunch of blocks all at once. And this is a great example. This is obviously using the regular slope blocks and not the 4-sided pyramids. But you get the idea. With each block that we place, we're making those slope blocks just a little bit thinner. And as a result, we get a soft curve instead of a slope. Do the same thing with the 4-sided pyramids and the inside corners like we're doing here. Fill everything in, and the filling in is basically increasing the ease of repairing this ship later on, because it's almost inevitable that you're going to have to repair it at some point. And if you're doing it manually, and you've got all these little wee tiny blocks that we use in order to get the shapes that we're looking for, repairing it is just really not very good at all. So we fill things in, and then once I'm happy with everything, once I've got everything done, basically, we'll select the whole thing and then we'll just spam the merge button a few times to merge all of these blocks together as best we can so that we end up with larger chunks. The reason I don't do it at the very beginning is because sometimes you want those little blocks. Those are the blocks that we use to line up the blocks that come after. So it's good to have them a little bit smaller while you're still working on that area. You get better granularity, you get better control, you can make things more detailed. And then once you're certain that you're not going to be, excuse me, coming back around and needing those small blocks to continue making adjustments or whatever, then we can merge them all together, get rid of the little wee tiny blocks as much as we can, and continue on with the build. You just saw me do this on the middle section, and now we're doing it on the outer part. And this part here is a little bit different because we've got the part that we just put in place and those parts that extend directly to either side of it. But then you can see down the left side, we've got some flat sections there that I want to attend to as well. And again, it's at this point here, there is so much armor between the very back of the ship and anything that's important on the inside that this is kind of superfluous. We don't really need it, but we have the opportunity. And what I feel we do need to do is do something about this flat back end, so we might as well make the most of it. A viewer gave me a really great suggestion around the time that I was talking about the size of the ship, and saying that when we get the ship complete, we can scale the entire ship. And I've noticed the button to do that, just kind of mousing over, but I haven't really given it a lot of attention. But it makes a lot of sense. If we've got this ship and it's going to be relative to the last ship that we did, this one is going to be outrageously expensive. In the grand scheme of things, maybe not so bad, but just talking strictly in terms of the last ship that we made, and the jump in cost between that one and this one is going to be absolutely massive. If it feels like it's outrageous, if it feels like I can't really justify trying to say that I'm at the very beginning or still very close to the very beginning of the game and flying around in a ship like this, we can scale the ship down and we lose a lot of the armor, a lot of the health in the hull, a lot of the equipment, the amount of cargo that we can hold, the amount of energy that we can store in the energy containers, the amount of energy we produce. All of these things get scaled down. The benefit being we get a reduced cost and a ship that's smaller and hopefully less prone to colliding with asteroids. The cost being, of course, that you can't expect to have a smaller ship that still has the same performance characteristics that you would normally associate with size as a much, much larger ship. And then we would still have a version of this ship saved, a full-size version, should we find ourselves in a position where we have the materials to build it before we've moved on to the next tier of materials and we start looking at things in that sort of light. It doesn't make sense to me if we have access to titanium to continue building with iron, and consequently if we have access to the next tier up of materials, it doesn't make sense that we would continue building with titanium necessarily. So it's all just kind of finding a balance, finding an equilibrium. When push comes to shove, the value of the ship, I'm making these sort of restrictions for myself, don't necessarily have to be there. But just for the sake of keeping things interesting, that's going to be the approach that we use, is we're going to kind of take a look at the total cost once it's built and then make some adjustments. I would laugh if this thing wound up actually being a quarter of the size that it is now, just so that we could get the material costs in line with what we could reasonably expect to afford. On this back section, you can see I'm at this really weird point where everything I'm doing is stacking up these little thin blocks. They're like little bricks to fill in everything, and trying to keep everything straight, which layer I'm on and where we should have the inside corners, where we should have the outside corners, the four-sided pyramids. And then once we get down to that strip that runs right across the middle of the back end of the ship, that's when I have to start integrating some of the common slope blocks back into the mix and have it line up with everything that we're doing here. So it's not overly complex. It's just at this point it's taking a little bit of time, because the one thing that we don't have in this particular part of the ship that we're putting in now, you can see again layering in more bricks, is that granularity, those small blocks that we can line things up against. Everything that we're adding to in this particular part of the ship is basically a large chunk. So we need to have these smaller little bits that we've broken it up into in order to have that backing and have those blocks to line up things with. I can't imagine trying to do all of this without the match tool. If I had to individually size and scale these blocks each time I wanted to place one in order to make it line up with the blocks before, I would probably lose my mind. I don't think there's really any potential outcome for me other than the absolute loss of my mind and faculties. It would be such a nightmare. But, I mean, I've encountered a few minor little hiccups with the build system, I guess you could say. And my first response is grr. But, you know, early access, that's the nature of the beast. One of the things that I uncovered recently is that sometimes, even though this is a single-player game, the network dies. It says it can't connect to the network, and it boots me out of the game, which is kind of funny until you realize how much of a pain in the ass it is. We're starting in the back end here, and what I'm doing now is I'm basically, the back end of the nacelles, just to be clear. I'm getting everything sort of started, getting a few key blocks into place so that we've got the basis for what we're going to be doing. And the whole idea I had was sort of like this idea of kind of pincers coming back off the nacelles. One of the things that I wanted to do was sort of close in that back section. We've got directional thrusters and gyros in the nacelles. You can see the gyros look like the sort of target on the back of some of those blocks, and then the directional thrusters are in between the gyros. And I wanted to give a little bit of extra protection for those, sort of cap off the back end before we started doing too much of a cosmetic nature. But at the same time, this is kind of a part of the ship that is also really done. Once we've got it capped off, there's not a whole lot that we need to add, but we have an opportunity to change the way that it looks to make it look a little bit more interesting. And this general sort of theme with the pincers and things a little bit more angular and a little less refined and rounded looking is going to be carried on in the front of the ship, and also a few other little details that we'll be adding on the back of the ship. So this is working with the common slope blocks and some of the cubes, the basic cubes, and they're all armored titanium blocks. But I started filling all this in and realized the visual effect when you're flying the ship around and it's using the directional thrusters is pretty spectacular. Like, there's some pretty massive plumes that fire out of these directional thrusters. We don't get the benefit of the visual effect from the engines so much because they're mostly, or at least 50% obscured by the grates that we put in the back for protection. So I decided that maybe it would be interesting just to kind of cap things off on this back end if I started using some of the light blocks that you can add. And the reason why I'm talking about it now as we're sort of filling this in is because the game crashed when I was trying to add the light blocks. So I loaded the game and I started working with the light blocks again, and it crashed again. And on the third crash, I said, to hell with it. I'm not going to keep doing what I've been doing. So there's been a little bit of a change in my approach to using the light blocks. So we're still going to use them, but not the way that I was planning on using them. And it was one of those errors, like I was talking about, where it's like you disconnect from the network even though you're playing a local single-player game, where everything just stops responding for about 30 seconds while the game figures out that there's no connection to this invisible imaginary network, and then it dumps to the desktop. And I was a little bit concerned when it happened the first time because I was in the middle of placing these blocks, and one of the things about these light blocks is that the light that comes off of them is so intense that as soon as you place one, you can no longer really see the area that it occupies because it's got this ultra bright sort of, it's not even like a halo effect, it's just like that shining sort of light effect where it's larger than the origin. So if you have a light bulb, it's a very, very bright light bulb, and you turn it on, the area that the light bulb occupies is super bright, and so is this sort of effect around it that makes it impossible to kind of see what's going on in that immediate area because it's just too damn bright. And my original plan was to just put in the lights, and I realized that that was going to be a no-go, because as soon as you start placing them, you can't work in that area anymore because you can't see anything. So I came up with a different idea. I would build the structure that I wanted for the lights out of regular titanium armor blocks, the stuff that I had on my hotbar. It didn't really matter what I was using as long as it was the shape that I wanted, and then used a substitute tool to swap them over and basically activate the lights once they had been built, and I'd done all the sizing and all the shaping and all the scaling and all that other stuff, and it still just wasn't interested, and it just kept crashing. So I have to be a little bit careful about the lights. I can see now why people would just use the lights as accent bits and not sort of central parts of a build, you know, major structural elements made out of these light blocks, because they're a bit much. They're a bit intense. And I feel like just from a usability standpoint, it would make a lot more sense if the brightness of the lights, the visual effect, was toned way down when you were in build mode, and then whenever you're done building and you leave build mode, then you see the normal effect. That to me would make a lot more sense. But again, early access, it looks like the developers have a lot on their plate, a lot of things that they're working on, a lot of things that they want to be working on. Kind of throw it in there as a quality of life improvement a little bit later on in the process. You can see here we've got the 4 pincers, the primary pincers, I guess we could call them, and now I'm putting in smaller ones in between. So if you rotate the whole concept 45 degrees, you've got these little openings, and we fill them in again with... I'm not trying to duplicate the shape. I don't think I could, for one thing, just because if we were following the shape, the profile of the back of the nacelles, we wouldn't have enough flat space to do it. But also, I think it would be kind of more interesting if we have these a little bit shorter, the ones that we're working on now. Fill them in, get them a little bit shorter, slightly different profile. It's a little bit of extra armor on the back of the ship, makes it a little bit more difficult for enemy fire to hit the area of the nacelles where we've got all of those critical details. And it gives us the basis of a slightly different approach to the theme that we can use as a springboard for other areas on the ship, so that we get a little bit more visual interest as we progress towards the end of the build. So in the next episode, we're going to be looking at the front of the ship, and only the front of the ship. That's, I think, I'm very tempted to just be all over the place doing all kinds of different things because I've got all these different ideas. But the place where I need to be spending most of my time right now, I think, is the front of the ship. Once we get that locked down, then we can come back around and do all of these things that I have in mind for the cosmetic aspect. I still have to, the only key thing that I have to keep in mind right now is we need a good, solid set of hard points to place the turrets that we're going to be having on the ship. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to have a ship this size if we don't have room to add all the turrets that we might find ourselves with once we upgrade all the systems and do all that. So I want to pre-design that. I want to have that in the back of my mind as we're doing the front of the ship, so that we can keep an eye on what we're allowing ourselves in terms of space for turrets. But that'll be the next episode. We'll be looking at that. So if you want to be notified about the next episode, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.